Listen, there are legends in the UFC, and then there's Jon Jones. A man so talented it's like he was built in a lab, and yet so controversial that every time he rises, he somehow finds a way to fall even harder. And that's the question today. How can the most gifted fighter on the planet also be the most self-destructive? This is the guy who dominated champions like they were sparring partners, but outside the cage, drug tests, hit-and-run cases, suspensions, chaos, drama, and decisions that almost burned his whole legacy to the ground. Some people call him the GOAT, some call him a cheat, some say he's misunderstood, but everyone agrees on one thing: Jon Jones is the most dangerous and the most unpredictable man in UFC history. And today, we're diving into the truth behind that chaos. You know, there's something fascinating about a guy who can be an absolute monster inside the cage, but the moment he steps outside, it feels like the real fight begins. And with Jon Jones, that contrast is almost impossible to ignore. This is a dude blessed with freakish talent, long reach, sharp instincts, timing that feels superhuman. He walks into the octagon like he was born there. The chaos of a real fight is where he finds peace. And that's wild to think about. But then you look at his personal life, and it feels like watching someone who's constantly wrestling with his own shadow. This guy's life off camera isn't just messy. It's complicated, unpredictable, almost like there's a storm that follows him around. And it's not the kind of storm you sympathize with. It's the kind you keep watching because you can't believe it keeps happening. There's something almost tragic about seeing a person who was raised in a structured religious family, a father who preached discipline, brothers who became top-level athletes, and still somehow ends up fighting a completely different kind of battle, a battle with himself. And the crazy thing, people don't just see him as a fighter, they see him as a symbol. To some, he's the greatest of all time, this perfect specimen of mind and muscle. To others, he's this walking contradiction, a guy who has everything but can't stop sabotaging it. It's like watching a superhero who forgets he's human until reality hits him like a brick. And that double life, the champion versus the flawed man, that's where the real story begins. Because greatness becomes so much more interesting when the person behind it is falling apart. There's a moment in every superstar's life where you see the cracks start to show. For Jon, one of the first real cracks came in 2012, that infamous DUI incident. People sometimes forget how huge that moment actually was. Here's this young, insanely dominant champion making headlines for destroying elite fighters, and suddenly the headlines change to something completely different: a wrecked car, a busted tree, flashing police lights. It's the kind of moment that reminds you fame can mess with people in ways we don't fully understand. When you go from being a regular guy to the guy, the pressure is insane. Everyone wants a piece of you. Everyone wants something. And then there's the expectation: win, 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 never mess up, never slip, never show weakness. But he did slip, hard. Imagine being in your 20s with money, fame, yes men around you, and no real boundaries. You win fights easier than other people wake up in the morning. You feel untouchable. And that's where the danger creeps in, when you start believing you can get away with anything. That DUI wasn't just an accident. It was a wake-up call he ignored. People thought he'd learn from it. But life doesn't work like that. Sometimes one mistake opens the door for 10 more. And in Jon's case, it was like a signal flare showing that something inside him was already unstable. Maybe stress, maybe ego, maybe that addictive thrill of going too far. But that night set the tone for everything that followed. It wasn't just a crash. It was the beginning of a pattern of self-destruction. The first chapter in the story of a man who could destroy anyone in a fight, but couldn't stop fighting himself. Now, this part of his story, this is where everything gets intense. Drug tests, failed tests, suspensions, titles stripped, and every time it happened, the shockwaves were massive. Because this wasn't just any fighter. This was the pound-for-pound king, the guy people called unbeatable. So when results came back with cocaine metabolites, banned substances, performance enhancers, it was like the MMA world froze. But here's the thing. This wasn't a one-time fluke. It kept happening. Different substances, different explanations, different timelines. And every single time, everyone had the same reaction. Why? Why would a guy this good risk everything? You look at Jon and you realize something deep. Talent doesn't protect you from chaos. Sometimes it attracts chaos. The problem isn't just the substances, it's what they represent. They represent impulse, pressure, escapism, self-sabotage. Some people drink to relax. Some people disappear for a weekend. Some people take substances because they feel invincible or insecure or lonely or whatever the hell is going on in their head at 3 a.m. And when you put that mindset into the life of a superstar, things explode. What made these drug test controversies even crazier was the timing. They always came when he was on top, when he was unbeatable, when he was about to cement his legacy even deeper, almost like a subconscious urge to destroy the very thing he built. And every time he'd come back, you'd see glimpses of responsibility, apology, maturity. But then the cycle would repeat. It makes you wonder, was the real battle ever against fighters like Cormier or Gustafsson, or was the real opponent always his own mind? This was the moment where everything shifted. Everything stopped, because a DUI is one thing, a failed drug test is another. But a hit and run, especially one involving a pregnant woman, that's a whole different level. It's the kind of story that doesn't just hurt your career, it stains your soul. Imagine the scene, a crash, panic, confusion, and then he runs. He leaves the car, leaves the scene, leaves the injured behind. That's the moment that felt like the final line being crossed. But then it gets worse. Reports said police found drugs in the car. Suddenly, this wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't I wasn't thinking or I had a bad night. This was full-blown chaos. A man running from consequences. A man who seemed terrified of the reality he created. And the world reacted instantly. UFC stripped him. Fans split in half. Media tore him apart. Some said he was done, finished, beyond redemption. But here's the part that sticks with you. He eventually walked back into the police station and surrendered. Not because he was forced, not because he had no choice, but because no matter how lost he gets, there's still that part of him that knows he has to face the truth. This incident wasn't just a scandal. It was a mirror. A brutal reflection of a man whose talent made him untouchable, but whose decisions made him fragile. And from that day forward, the world didn't look at Jon Jones as the unstoppable champion anymore. They saw a flawed human being who was spiraling, a man capable of greatness, but equally capable of disaster. It was the moment people realized, inside the cage he fights opponents, outside the cage he fights himself, and sometimes he loses. When you talk about Jon Jones, you always end up at the same question. Is he the greatest fighter ever or the biggest problem child in UFC history? And honestly, that's what makes him such a fascinating figure, because both sides might be right. On one hand, you have this unbelievable athlete, a guy who beats legends, dominates champions, and makes elite fighters look confused, frustrated, almost helpless. His fight IQ is unreal. He sees things other people don't. He reacts before the opponent even fully commits. It's almost like he fights in slow motion while everyone else is stuck in real time. But then there's the other hand, the arrests, the drugs, the recklessness, the chaos. People watch him and think, how can someone this gifted keep messing up like this? And that's the part that drives fans crazy. The greatness is there. The discipline isn't. Some fans defend him no matter what. They say things like, he's human. He made mistakes. What he does outside the cage doesn't change what he did inside. And then there's the other group, the ones who believe talent doesn't erase responsibility. They look at him and see wasted potential, constant drama, and a man who could have been the cleanest, most perfect GOAT ever, but instead chose chaos. That's the tension. That's the conflict. That's why videos about him go viral. People love greatness, but they're addicted to controversy. And Jon Jones is the perfect mixture of both. At the end of the day, maybe that's his real legacy. Not the belts, not the wins, not the highlights, but the story of a man who had everything and kept fighting battles the world never saw. It leaves us with one final question. Does greatness mean perfection? Or does greatness mean surviving your own demons? You know, at the end of the day, stories like this are wild because you're not just talking about a fighter. You're talking about a human being who walked through fire, sometimes his own fire, and somehow kept going. And whether you love him or hate him, you can't deny the impact. You can't deny the complexity. You can't deny that this is a guy who lived a life most people couldn't handle for 5 minutes. And that's the thing that always blows my mind. Greatness isn't clean. Greatness isn't perfect. Greatness is messy, chaotic, unpredictable, and sometimes painful to watch. But it's real, and that's what makes a story like this so damn fascinating, because every time he fell, every time he self-destructed, every time people wrote him off, he stood back up, not gracefully, not politely, but in his own wild, flawed human way. And that's why people still argue about him, because he represents something bigger than wins and losses. He represents the fight inside every person who's ever battled their own demons. So whatever you think about him, whether he's the GOAT, the villain, the tragedy, or the comeback king, let me know your take. Tell me in the comments, who is Jon Jones to you? A legend or a warning? And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure you like the video, share it with your friends, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more insane stories, breakdowns, and raw conversations just like this. Because trust me, there are a lot more stories out there worth talking about, and we're just getting started.